of Mice and Men, Chapter 2. The bunkhouse was a long rectangular building. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and the floor unpainted. In 3 walls there were small square windows, and in the 4th a solid door with a wooden latch. Against the walls were 8 bunks, 5 of them made up with blankets and the other 3 showing their burlap ticking. Over each bunk there were nailed an apple box with an opening forward so it made 2 shelves for the personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. And these shelves were loaded with little articles, soap and talcum powder, razors, and those Western magazines ranchmen loved to read and scoff at and secretly believe. And there were medicines on the shelves, in little vials, combs, and from the nails in the box sides, a few neckties. Near one wall there was a black cast-iron stove, its stovepipe going straight up through the ceiling. In the middle of the room stood a big square table littered with playing cards, and around it were grouped boxes for the players to sit on. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun threw a bright, dust-laden bar through one of the side windows, and in and out of the beam flies shot through, rushing like stars. The wooden latch raised, the door opened, and a tall, stoop-shouldered man came through. He was dressed in blue jeans and he carried a big push broom in his left hand. Behind him came George, and behind George, Lennie. "The boss was expecting you last night," the old man said. "He was sore as heck when you wasn't there to go out this morning." He pointed at his right arm, but no hand. He pointed with his right arm, and out of the sleeve came a round stick-like wrist, but no hand. "You can have them 2 beds there," he said, indicating the 2 bunks near the stove. George stepped over and threw his blankets down on the burlap sack of straw that was his mattress. He looked into the box shelf, and then picked a small yellow can from it. "Say, what the heck is this?" "I don't know," says the old man. "It says positively kills lice, roaches, and other scourges." "What the heck kind of bed you giving us anyways? We don't want no pant rabbits." The old swamper shifted his broom and held it in between his elbow and his side while he had out his hand for the can. He studied the label carefully. "Tell you what," he said finally. "Last guy that had this bed was a blacksmith. Heck of a nice fella and as clean guy as you want to meet. Used to wash his hands even after he ate." "But how come he got graybacks?" George was working up a slow anger. Lennie put his bindle on in a neighboring bunk and sat down. He watched George with open mouth. "Tell you what," says the old swamper. "This here blacksmith, name of Whitey, was the kind of guy that would put stuff around even if there wasn't no bugs, just to make sure, see? Tell you what he used to do. At meals he'd peel his boiled potatoes and he'd take out every little spot, no matter what kind, before he'd eat it. And if there was a red splotch on an egg, he'd scrape it off. Finally quit about the food. That's the kind of guy he was, clean. Used to dress up Sundays even though he wasn't going no place. Put on a necktie even, and then sat out on his bunkhouse." "I ain't so sure," said George skeptically. "What did you say you quit for?" The old man put a yellow can in his pocket, and he rubbed his bristly white whiskers with his knuckles. "Why, he just quit the way the guy will. Says it was the food, just wanted to move. Didn't give no other reason but the food. Just says, 'Give me my time one night,' the way any guy would." George lifted his tick and looked underneath of it. He leaned over and inspected the sacking closely. Immediately, Lennie got up and did the same with his bed. Finally, George seemed satisfied. He unrolled his bindle and put things on the shelf. His razor and bar of soap, his comb and bottle of pills, his liniment and leather wristband. Then he made his bed up neatly with blankets. The old man said, "I guess the boss will be out here in a minute. He was sure burned when you wasn't here this morning. Come right in when he was eating breakfast and says, 'Where the heck are them new men?' And he give the stable buck heck too." George patted a wrinkle out of his bed and sat down. "Give the stable buck heck?" he asked. "Sure, you see the stable buck's a nigger." "Nigger, huh?" "Yeah, a nice fella too. Got a crook back when a horse kicked him. The boss gives him heck when he's mad, but the stable buck don't give a dang about that. He reads a lot. Got books in his room." "What kind of guy is the boss?" George asked. "Well, he's pretty nice fella. Gets pretty mad sometimes, but he's pretty nice. Tell you what, know what he done in Christmas? Bring a gallon of whiskey right here and says, 'Drink hearty, boys. Christmas comes but once a year.' The heck he did. A whole gallon?" "Yes, sir. Jesus, we had fun. They let the nigger come in that night. Little Skinner named of Smitty took after the nigger. Done pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so the nigger got him. If he could have used the feet, Smitty would have killed the nigger. The guy said on the account of the nigger's got a crook back, Smitty can't use his feet. He paused in relish of the memory. After that, the guys went to Soledad and raised heck. I didn't go in there. I ain't got no poop anymore. Lennie was just finishing making his bed. The wooden latch raised again and the door opened. A little stocky man stood in the open doorway. He wore blue jean trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest, and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck in the belt on each side of the square steel buckle. On his head was a soiled brown Stetson hat, and he wore the high-heeled boots and spurs to prove he was not a laboring man. The old swamper looked quickly at him, and then shuffled to the door, rubbing his whiskers with his knuckles as he went. "Them guys just come," he said, and shuffled past the boss and out of the door. The boss stepped in the room with the short, quick steps of a fat-legged man. "I wrote Murray and Reddy I wanted them 2 men this morning. You got your work slips?" George reached into his pocket and produced the slips and handed them to the boss. "It wasn't Murray and Reddy's phone. Says right here on the slip that you was to be here to work this morning. Bus driver gave us a bum steer," he said. "We had to walk 10 miles. Says we was here but we wasn't. We couldn't get no rides in the morning." The boss squinted his eyes. "Well, I had to send out the grain team short 2 buckers. Won't do any good to go out now till after dinner." He pulled his time book out of his pocket and opened it where a pencil was stuck between the leaves. George scowled meaningfully at Lennie, and Lennie nodded to show what he understood. The boss looked his pencil. "What's your name?" "George Milton." "And yours?" George said. "His name is Lennie Small. The name's entered in the book. Let's see. This is the 20th, noon the 20th. He closed the book. "Where do you guys been working?" "Up around weeds," said George. "You too?" to Lennie. "Yeah, him too," said George. The boss pointed a playful finger at Lennie. "He ain't much of a talker, is he?" "No, he ain't, but he's sure a heck of a good worker. Strong as a bull." Lennie smiled to himself. "Strong as a bull," he repeated. George scowled at him, and Lennie dropped his head in shame and having forgotten. The boss said suddenly, "Listen, Small." Lennie raised his head. "What can you do?" In a panic, Lennie looked at George for help. "He can do anything you can tell him," said George. "He's a good skinner. He can wrestle grain bags, drive a culminator. He can do anything. Just give him a try." The boss turned on George. "Then why don't you let him answer? What are you trying to put over?" George broke in loudly. "Oh, I ain't saying he's bright, he ain't. But I say he's a goddamn good worker. He can put up a 400-pound bale." The boss deliberately put a little book on his pocket. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and squinted, one eye nearly closed. "Say, what you selling?" "Huh?" I said, "What stake you got in this guy? You talking his pay away from him?" "No, of course I ain't. What do you think I'm selling him out?" "Well, I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I'd just like to know what your interest is." George said, "He's my cousin. I told his old lady I'd take care of him. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He's all white, just ain't bright, but he can do anything you tell him." The boss turned halfway. "Well, God knows you don't need the brains to buck barley bags. Well, don't you try putting nothing over, Milton. I got an eye on you. Why'd you quit and weed?" "Job was done," said George promptly. "What kind of job?" We was digging a cesspool." "All right, but don't try to put nothing over, 'cause you can't get away with nothing. I seen wise guys before. Go on out with the grain teams after dinner. They're picking up barley at the threshing machine. Go out with Slim's team." "Slim?" "Yeah, big tall Skinner. You'll see him after dinner." He turned abruptly and went to the door, but before he went out he turned and looked for a long moment at the 2 men. When the sound of his footsteps had died away, George turned on Lennie. "So you wasn't gonna say a word? You was gonna leave your big flapper shut and leave me do the talking? Dang near lost us the job." Lennie stared hopelessly at his hands. "I forgot, George." "Yeah, you forgot. You always forget. And I gotta talk you out of it." He sat down heavily on the bunk. "Now he's got an eye on us. Now we gotta be careful and make no slips. You keep your big flapper shut after this." He fell morosely silent. "George, what you want now?" "I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George?" "Be a dang good thing if you was," George said viciously. "Save everybody a heck of a lot of trouble." "You said it was your cousin, George." "Well, that was a lie, and I'm dang glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself." He stopped suddenly, stepped to the open front door and peered out. "Say, what the heck you doing listening?" The old man came slowly into the room. He had his broom in his hand, and at his heels there was a drag-footed sheepdog, gray of muzzle, and with pale, blind old eyes. The dog struggled lamely to the side of the room and lay down, grunting softly to himself and licking his grizzled, moth-eaten coat. The swamper watched him until he was settled. I wasn't listening, I was just standing in the shade a minute scratching my dog. I just now finished swamping out in the wash house. You was just poking your big ears into our business, George said. I don't like nobody getting nosy. The old man looked uneasy from George to Lennie and then back. I just come here, he said. I didn't hear nothing you guys were saying. I ain't interested in nothing you were saying. A guy in the ranch don't never listen, nor do we ask no questions. Dang right he don't, said George, slightly mollified. Not if he wants to stay working long. But he was reassured by the swamper's defense. Come on in, sit down a minute, he said. The heck of an old dog. Yeah, I had him ever since he was a pup. God, he was a good sheepdog when he was younger. He stood his broom against the wall and rubbed his white bristled cheek with his knuckles. How'd you like the boss, he asked. Pretty good, seemed alright. He's a nice fellow, the swamper agreed. You gotta take him right. At that moment a young man came down a bunkhouse. A thin young man with a brown face, with brown eyes and a head tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. See my old man, he asked, the swamper said. He was just here a minute ago, Curley. He went over to the cookhouse, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curley. His eyes passed over the new man and stopped. He glanced coldly at George, then at Lennie. His arms gradually bent at the elbows and his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Lennie squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curley stepped gingerly close to him. You the new guys the old man was waiting for? We just come in, said George. Let the big guy talk. Lennie twisted with embarrassment. George said, suppose he don't want to talk. Curley lashed his body around. By Christ, he's gonna talk when he spoke to. What the heck are you getting into it for? We travel together, said George coldly. Oh, so that's why. George was tense and motionless. Yeah, it's that way. Lennie was looking helplessly to George for instruction. And you won't let the big guy talk, is that it? He can talk if he wants to tell you anything, he nodded slightly to Lennie. We just come in, said Lennie softly. Curley stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you're spoke to. He turned toward the door and walked out, and his elbows were still bent out a little. George watched him out and turned back to the swamper. Say, what the heck he's got on his shoulder? Lennie didn't do nothing to him. The old man looked cautiously at the door to make sure no one was listening. That's the boss's son, he said quietly. Curley's pretty handy. He done quite a bit on the ring. He's a lightweight and he's handy. Well, let him be handy, said George. You don't have to take after Lennie. Lennie didn't do nothing to him. What's he got against Lennie? The swamper considered. Well, tell you what. Curley's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys, kinda like he's mad at him because he ain't big guy. You seen little guys like that, ain't you? Always scrappy? Sure, said George. I seen plenty tough little guys. But this Curley better not make no mistakes about Lennie. Lennie ain't handy, but his Curley's punk is going to get hurt if he messes around with Lennie. Well, Curley's pretty handy, the swamper said skeptically. Never did seem right to me. Suppose Curley jumps a big guy and licks him. Everybody says what a game guy Curley is. And suppose he does the same thing and gets licked. Then everyone says the big guy ought to pick somebody on his own size. And then maybe they gang up on the big guy. Never did seem right to me. Seems like Curley ain't giving nobody a chance. George was watching the door. He said ominously, well, he better watch out for Lennie. Lennie ain't no fighter, but Lennie's strong and quick and Lennie don't know no rules. He walked to the square table and sat down on one of the boxes. He gathered some cards together and shuffled them. The old man sat down on another box. Don't tell Curley I said none of this. He'd slow me. He won't ever get candy because his old man's the boss. George cut the cards and began turning them over, looking at each one and throwing it down on a pile. He said, this guy Curley sounds like a son of a gun to me. I don't really like mean little guys. Seems to me he's a little worse lately, said the swamper. He got married a couple weeks ago. Wife lives over the boss's house. Seems like Curley has been cockier ever since he got married. George grunted. Maybe he's showing off for his wife. The swamper warmed to the gossip. You seen that glove on his left hand? Yeah, I seen it. Well, that glove's full of Vaseline. Vaseline? What the heck for? Well, I'll tell you what. Curley says he's keeping that hand soft for his wife. George studied the cards absorbedly. That's a dirty thing to tell around, he said. The old man was reassured. He had drawn a derogatory statement from George. He felt safe now, and he spoke more confidently. Wait till you see Curley's wife. George cut the cards again and put out a solitaire lay, slowly and deliberately. Purty, he asked casually. Yeah, purty, but... George studied his cards. But what? Well, she got the eye. Yeah? married 2 weeks ago and got the eye? Maybe that's why Curly's pants is full of ants. I seen her give Slim the eye. Slim's a jerk-line skinner. Heck of a nice fella. Slim don't need to wear no high-heeled boots on a grain team. I seen her give Slim the eye. Curly never seen it, and I seen her give Carlson the eye. George pretended a lack of interest. Looks like he was gonna have some fun. The swamper stood up from his box. You know what I think? George did not answer. Well, I think Curly's married. A tart. He ain't the first, said George. There's plenty done that. The old man moved toward the door. His ancient dog lifted his head and peered about, and then got painfully to his feet to follow. I gotta be setting out these wash basins for the guys. The teams will be in before long. You guys got the buck barley? Yeah. You won't tell Curly nothing I said? Heck no. Well, you look her over, mister. You see if she ain't a tart. He stepped out of the door into the brilliant sunshine. George laid down his cards thoughtfully. Turned piles of 3. He built 4 clubs of his ace pile. The sun square was on the floor now, and his flies whipped through like sparks. A sound of jiggling harness and the croak of heavily laden axles sounded from outside. From the distance came a clear call. Stable buck, oh stable buck. And then, where the heck is that goddamn nigger? George stared in his solitary lay, and then flounced the cards together and turned to Lennie. Lennie was lying down on a bunk watching him. Look, Lennie, this ain't no setup. I'm scared. I'm gonna have trouble with this Curly guy. I think I've seen that kind before. He was kinda feeling you out. He figures he's got you scared and he's gonna take a sock at you the first chance he gets. Lennie's eyes were frightened. I don't want no trouble, he said plaintively. Don't let him sock me, George. George got up and went over to Lennie's bunk and then sat down on it. I hate that kinda guy. I've seen plenty of him. Like the old guy says, Curly don't take no chances. He always wins. He thought for a moment. If he tangles with you, Lennie, we're gonna get the can. Don't make no mistake about that. He's the boss's son. Look, Lennie, you try to keep him away from him, will ya? Don't ever speak to him. If he comes in here, you move clear to the other side of the room. Will you do that, Lennie? I don't want no trouble, Lennie mourned. I never done nothing to him. Well, that won't do you no good if Curly wants to plug himself up for a fighter. Just don't do nothing to him. Will you remember? Sure, George. I ain't gonna say a word. The sound of the approaching grain teams was louder. Thought of the big hooves on the ground, drag brakes, and the jingle of trace chains. The men were calling back and forth from the teams. George, sitting on the bunk beside Lennie, frowned as he thought. Lennie asked timidly, You ain't mad, George? I ain't mad at you. I'm mad at this here Curly guy. I hoped he was gonna get a little stake together. Maybe $100. His tone grew decisive. You keep away from Curly, Lennie. Sure I will, George. I won't say a word. Don't let him pull you in, but if the son of a gun socks you, let him have it. Let him have what, George? Never mind. I'll tell you when. I hate that kind of guy. Look, Lennie, if you get in any kind of trouble, you remember what I told you to do. Lennie raised up on his elbow, his face contorted with thought. Then his eyes moved sadly to George's face. If I get in any trouble, you ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits. That's not what I meant. You remember where we slept last night? Down by the river? Oh yeah, I remember. Oh, sure I remember. I go and hide in the brush. Hide till I come for you. Don't let nobody see you. Hide in the brush by the river. Say that over. Hide in the brush by the river. Down in the brush by the river. If you get in trouble. If I get in trouble. A brake screeched outside. A call came. Stable buck, oh stable buck. George said, Say it over to yourself, Lennie, so you won't forget it. Both men glanced up, for the rectangle of sunshine in the doorway was cut off. A girl was standing there looking in. She had full rouged lips with wide-spaced eyes heavily made up. Her fingernails were red. Her hair hung in little rolled clusters like sausages. She wore a cotton house dress and red mules, on insteps which were like bouquets of red ostrich feathers. I'm looking for Curly, she said. Her voice has a nasal, brittle quality. George looked away from her, then back. He was in here a minute ago, but he went. Oh. She put her hands behind her back and leaned against the doorframe so that her body was thrown forward. You're the new fellas that just come, ain't ya? Yeah. Lennie's eyes moved down her body, and though she did not seem to be looking at Lennie, she brindled a little. She looked at her fingernails. Sometimes Curly's in here, she explained. George said brusquely, Well, he ain't now. If he ain't, I guess I better look someplace else, she said playfully. Lennie watched her, fascinated. George said, If I see him, I'll pass the word you was looking for him. She smiled archly and twitched her body. Nobody can't blame a person for looking, she said. There were footsteps behind her going by. She turned her head. Hi, Slim, she said. Slim's voice came through the door. Hi, good looking. I'm trying to find Curly, Slim. Well, you ain't trying very hard. I seen him going into your house. She was suddenly apprehensive. And bye, boys, she called into the bunkhouse and she hurried away. George looked around at Lennie. Jesus, what a tramp, he said. So that's what Curley picks for a wife? She's purty, says Lennie defensively. Yeah, and she's sure hiding it. Curley got his work ahead of him. Bet she'd clear out for 20 bucks. Lennie still stared at the doorway where she had been. Gosh, she was pretty. He smiled admiringly. George looked quickly down at him, and then he took him by the ear and shook him. Listen to me, you crazy guy, he said fiercely. Don't even take a look at that girl. I don't care what she says or what she does. I've seen him poisoned before, but I've never seen a piece of jailbait worse than her. You leave her be. Lennie tried to disengage his ear. I never done nothing, George. No, you never. When she was standing in the doorway showing her legs, you wasn't looking the other way neither. I never meant no harm, George. Honest, I never. Well, you keep away from her, 'cause she's rat trap, if I ever seen one. You let Curley take the rap. He let himself into it, glove full of Vaseline, George said disgustedly. And I bet he's eating raw eggs and right into the patent medicine houses. Lennie cried out suddenly. I don't like this place, George. This ain't no good place. I want to get out of here. We gotta keep it till we get a steak. We can't help it, Lennie. We can get out of here just as soon as we can. I don't like it no better than you do. He went back to the table and set out a new solitaire hand. No, I don't like it, he said. For 2 bits I'd shove out there. If we can just get a few dollars in the poke, we'll shove 'em out and go up to the American River and pan gold. We can make maybe a couple of dollars a day there, and we might hit a pocket. Lennie leaned eagerly toward him. Let's go, George. Let's get out of here. It's mean here. We gotta stay, said George shortly. Shut up now. The guy's coming in. From the washroom nearby came the sound of running water and rattling basins. George studied the cards. Maybe we ought to wash up, he said, but we ain't done nothing to get dirty. A tall man stood in the doorway. He held a crushed Stetson hat under his arm while he was combed his long, black, damp hair straight back. Like the others, he wore blue jeans and a short denim jacket. When he had finished combing his hair, he moved into the room, and he had moved with his majesty only achieved by a royalty and master craftsman. He was a jerk-line skinner, the prince of a ranch capable of driving 10, 16, even 20 mules with a single line into the leaders. He was capable of killing a fly on a wheeler's butt with a bullwhip without touching the mule. There was a gravity in his manner, and a quiet so profound that all talk stopped when he spoke. His authority was so great that his word was taken on any subject, be it politics or love. This was Slim, the jerk-line skinner. His hatchet face was ageless. He might have been 35 or even 50. His ear heard more than what was said to him, and his slow speech had overtones not of thought, but of understanding beyond thought. His hands, large and lean, were as delicate in their action as those of a temple dancer. He smoothed out his crutched hat, creased in the middle, and put it on. He looked kindly at the two in the bunkhouse. It's brighter than freak outside, he said gently. Can hardly see anything in there. You the new guys? Just come, said George. Got buck barley? That's what the boss says. Slim sat down on a box across the table from George. He studied the solitaire hand that was upside to him. Hope you get on my team, he said. His voice was very gentle. I got a pair of punks on my team that don't know what barley bag from a blue ball. You guys never even bucked any barley? Heck yes, said George. I ain't nothing to scream about, but the big guy over here can pull up more grain alone than most pears can. Lennie, who had been following the conversation back and forth with his eyes, smiled complacently at the compliment. Slim looked approvingly at George for having given the compliment. He leaned over the table and snapped the corner on a loose card. You guys travel around together? His tone was friendly. It invited confidence without demanding it. Sure, said George. We kinda look after each other. He indicated Lennie with his thumb. He ain't all bright. Heck of a good worker, though. Heck of a nice fella, but he ain't very bright. I've known him for a long time. Slim looked through George and beyond him. Ain't many guys travel around together, he mused. I don't know why. Maybe everybody in the whole dang world is scared of each other. It's a lot nicer to go around with a guy you know, said George. A powerful, big-stomached man came into the bunkhouse. His head still dripped with water from scrubbing and dousing. Hi, Slim, he said, and then stopped and stared at George and Lennie. These guys just come, said Slim by the way of introduction. Glad to meet ya, the big man said. My name's Carlson. I'm George Milton, and this here's Lennie Small. Glad to meet ya, Carlson said again. You ain't very small. He chuckled softly at this joke. Ain't small at all, he repeated. Meant to ask you, Slim, how's your girl? I seen she wasn't under your wagon this morning. She slaying her pups last night, said Slim. 9 of 'em. I drowned 4 of 'em right off. She couldn't feed that many. You got 5 left, huh? Yeah, 5. I kept the biggest. What kind of dogs do you think they're gonna be? I don't know, said Slim. Some kind of shepherds, I guess. That's the most kind I seen around here when she was in heat. Carlson went on. Got 5 pups, huh? Gonna keep all of them? I don't know. Have to keep them a while so they can drink Lulu's milk. Carlson said thoughtfully. Well, look at here, Slim. I've been thinking. That dog of Candy's is so goddamn old he can't hardly walk. Stinks like heck, too. Every time he comes to the bunkhouse, I can smell him for 2-3 days. Why don't you get Candy to shoot his old dog and give him one of the pups to raise up? I can smell that dog a mile away. Got no teeth, dang near blind, and can't eat. Candy feeds him milk, he can't chew nothing else. George had began staring intently at Slim. Suddenly a triangle began to ring outside, slowly at first, and then faster and faster until the beat of it disappeared into one ringing sound. It stopped as suddenly as it started. There she goes, said Carlson. Outside there was a burst of voices as a group of men went by. Slim stood up slowly and with dignity. You guys better come on while there's still something to eat. Won't be nothing left in a couple minutes. Carlson stepped back to let Slim precede him, and then the two of them went out the door. Lennie was watching George excitedly. George rummaged his cards into a messy pile. Yeah, George said. I heard him, Lennie. I'll ask him. A brown and white one? Lennie cried excitedly. Come on, let's get dinner. I don't know whether you got a brown or white one. Lennie didn't move from his bunk. You ask him right away, George, so he won't kill no more of them. Sure, come on now, get off your feet. Lennie rolled off his bunk and stood up, and the two of them started for the door. Just as they reached it, Curley bounced in. You seen a girl around here? He demanded angrily. George said coldly, about a half an hour ago, maybe. What the heck was she doing? George stood still, watching the still angry man. He said insultedly, She said she was looking for you. Curley seemed really to see George for the first time. His eyes flashed over George, took in the height, measured his reach, looked at his trim middle. Well, which way'd she go? He demanded at last. I don't know, said George. I didn't watch her go. Curley scowled at him, and turning, he hurried out the door. George said, You know, Lennie, I'm scared I'm going to tangle that guy myself. I hate his guts. Jesus Christ. Come on. There won't be a dang thing left to eat. They went out the door, the sunshine lay in a thin line under the window. From a distance there could be heard a rattle of dishes. After a moment the ancient dog walked lamely in through the open door. He gazed out with a mild, half-blind eyes. He sniffed and then lay down and put his head between his paws. Curley popped into the doorway again and stood looking into the room. The dog raised his head, but when Curley jerked out, the grizzled head sank into the floor again.